The day I moved to Willow Cove, I thought I'd found paradise. Nestled at the edge of a serene lake, the neighborhood was picturesque, its houses neatly arranged along winding paths and shaded by mature trees whose branches gently brushed the roofs during windy days. My property was modest but cozy, complete with a charming old boathouse perched over the water, painted white and framed by weathered wooden beams. At sunrise, reflections of pink and gold danced along its walls, a gentle reminder of nature's poetry in my own backyard. At first glance, Willow Cove was tranquil, filled with warm neighbors who waved from porches and exchanged freshly baked pies on holidays. But beneath its pleasant surface simmered an undercurrent of strict regulation, embodied most keenly by our homeowners association. The rules were many, articulated in thick binders stacked neatly in each resident's home. They governed everything from fence height to flower varieties allowed in front gardens. Initially, I shrugged off this bureaucratic obsession, comforted by the beauty and order that resulted from such attention to detail. But as months turned to years, the shadows of overbearing conformity became harder to ignore. The quietude I sought was punctuated by increasingly frequent meetings filled with trivial complaints, each more trivial than the last. Central to these gatherings was Karen, tall and commanding, her meticulous hair always perfectly styled, a pair of designer glasses perpetually balanced on the tip of her nose. Her voice carried authority without warmth, frequently rising above polite chatter to emphasize minor grievances that kept Willow Cove exactly as she envisioned it. My boathouse soon drew Karen's attention. Perhaps its vintage charm felt discordant against her modern aesthetic sensibilities, or perhaps she simply saw in it an opportunity to assert control. Subtle hints began to accumulate, delivered in carefully worded letters, politely suggesting renovations or outright demolition. Yet, as her requests went unheeded, her frustration grew palpable. Still, I loved the boathouse fiercely, cherishing it as the last refuge of genuine peace within the ever-tightening embrace of HOA regulations. It represented simplicity and escape, a reminder of why I'd first fallen in love with Willow Cove. Little did I realize that Karen, driven by frustration or a twisted sense of entitlement, was quietly formulating her own solution, a solution destined to ignite a confrontation that would reverberate through the entire community, exposing the absurdity beneath the polite veneer of our lakeside haven. Karen Franklin was the undisputed anchor of Willow Cove, the self-appointed guardian of order whose mere presence shaped neighborhood dynamics. She lived precisely 4 houses down from mine, in a sprawling 2-story colonial that boasted impeccable white siding, symmetrical windows gleaming with regular cleanings, and an array of perfectly pruned boxwoods lining the walkway. Her lawn, eternally lush and emerald, set the bar impossibly high for the rest of us. Even the flowers she planted seemed to bloom obediently, staying within their neat borders as if fearing reprimand. Karen's meticulous appearance matched her home's disciplined aesthetic. Each day she emerged, sharply dressed, favoring tailored outfits in muted tones, accented occasionally by subtle yet expensive jewelry. Her chestnut hair, invariably styled into a flawless bob, refused to yield to weather or chance. Behind sleek, rectangular glasses, her dark eyes constantly assessed, revealing little warmth. It seemed as though nothing escaped her vigilant gaze, each observation tucked away for future reference in conversations or disputes. In meetings held at the community clubhouse, Karen was unchallenged in her dominance. The cadence of her speech was precise, carrying effortlessly across the hall as she outlined regulations and emphasized the importance of adherence. She wielded HOA rules like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and unhesitating, dissecting even minor deviations with clinical exactness. If a fence stood an inch too high or a mailbox leaned just slightly out of alignment, Karen would calmly but unmistakably announce the violation, often phrasing her criticisms as helpful suggestions that no one misunderstood as optional. My earliest interactions with Karen were superficially cordial, her polite greetings delivered with perfect civility and no trace of genuine friendliness. Her questions felt pointed beneath their apparent casualness, each inquiry seeking information or subtly assessing compliance. Initially, I brushed off the sense of unease she stirred, reassuring myself that someone needed to maintain order, and perhaps this was just Karen's way of expressing care for the community. Yet, slowly, her meticulousness revealed itself as something deeper and more unsettling. Her influence became apparent in ways large and small. Decisions about shared spaces and neighborhood improvements inevitably reflected Karen's personal tastes and standards, dismissing alternatives as impractical or unsightly. Neighbors who quietly resisted or expressed alternative opinions found themselves subtly sidelined, their voices overshadowed by Karen's confident, authoritative presence. Despite occasional murmurs of frustration among neighbors, Karen maintained her dominance through sheer persistence and unyielding precision. Beneath her polite exterior simmered a resolve so potent it could and frequently did shape the neighborhood according to her exacting preferences. None of us fully realized just how far she might go, how far her determination to control the minutiae of Willow Cove could extend, until she turned her calculating eyes toward my beloved boathouse. It began on a Wednesday afternoon, under the soft light of late spring. I had been away for only 2 days, visiting relatives out of town. When I returned, something felt off, a subtle disturbance that hung invisibly in the air. Approaching the edge of my property, my eyes instinctively sought out the familiar silhouette of my boathouse, nestled quietly along the gentle shoreline. But as I drew closer, a strange detail emerged, unsettling and unmistakable. A new set of curtains hung from the windows, sheer white fabric fluttering gently in the breeze. My boathouse had never worn curtains before. Bewildered, I quickened my pace, gravel crunching beneath my feet. As I approached, the boathouse door opened with a swift confidence, and there stood Karen, framed perfectly within the doorway, as though she belonged there. Her expression was composed, almost serene, her posture radiating entitlement. She stepped onto the small deck that extended out over the water, greeting me with a smile that barely masked a challenge. "I suppose you're wondering why I'm here," she said, her voice level and precise, devoid of embarrassment or apology. She gestured vaguely toward the interior behind her. "The association has determined that this structure no longer aligns with neighborhood standards. Since you refused to act, I decided to set an example." I stared at her, momentarily speechless, struggling to grasp the audacity of her actions. Behind her, the boathouse interior had indeed changed. Furniture I didn't recognize was arranged neatly, a small table holding a decorative lamp that glowed warmly. A woven rug covered part of the wooden floor, its presence starkly out of place against the aged planks I knew so well. "Karen," I finally managed to respond, my voice strained with controlled disbelief. "This is my private property. You can't just move into my boathouse." She raised her chin slightly, adjusting her glasses with calculated poise. "Private property or not, we all have an obligation to the community," she replied calmly, as if reciting from one of her beloved HOA documents. "I've petitioned repeatedly for this structure to be addressed. Your continued non-compliance left me little choice." Neighbors began to drift toward us from adjacent properties, their faces a blend of curiosity and apprehension. Murmured conversations sprang up, punctuated by expressions of shock and intrigue. Karen noted their presence with mild approval, clearly pleased to have an audience for her spectacle. "You've gone too far this time," I told her firmly, feeling heat rising to my face despite my efforts at composure. "This is trespassing, pure and simple." Karen's lips curved into a tight, knowing smile. She stepped forward slightly, closing some of the distance between us. "Perhaps legally," she conceded lightly, her tone still oddly untroubled. "But morally, I'm simply upholding the standards we all agreed upon when joining this community." Her confidence, unshakable and profoundly irritating, left me momentarily floundering. Around us, neighbors waited, their eyes flicking between Karen's steady gaze and my mounting frustration. Though a few appeared sympathetic, none immediately stepped forward to intercede, wary perhaps of crossing Karen's considerable influence. "I suggest you reconsider your position," Karen continued, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its underlying authority. "The boathouse would better serve Willow Cove's collective interests, as an example of modern compliance, refusing to see that benefits no one." Her presumption, couched in language designed to convey reasonableness, sharpened my anger rather than diminished it. As the sun slipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the water, I knew with absolute certainty that no polite request or HOA bylaw would restore reason to the situation. Karen's illegal occupation demanded a response that matched, or even surpassed, her audacious sense of entitlement. The following morning dawned quietly, the lake smooth and reflective beneath the muted colors of sunrise. After a restless night spent mulling over Karen's brazen move, I decided diplomacy would be my first strategy. Armed with logic and hoping for civility, I approached the boathouse, now feeling strangely foreign despite my long-standing ownership. Karen was already awake, and outside, seated comfortably in a wooden Adirondack chair she had presumably imported overnight. She sipped coffee from an elegant mug, her gaze fixed placidly on the lake, as if her occupation were entirely normal. Gathering myself, I greeted her with forced politeness, and suggested we speak rationally about the situation. She looked up slowly, granting me an indulgent smile, and motioned graciously toward a second chair, clearly placed for just such an occasion. Reluctantly I sat, noticing again how thoroughly she had made herself at home in my space. "I think we've had a misunderstanding," I began gently, striving to keep my voice calm and steady. "Surely you realize that occupying my boathouse is entirely inappropriate. I'm willing to hear your concerns, but this isn't the solution." Karen set her mug carefully on a side table and folded her hands neatly in her lap. Her gaze, sharp and attentive, studied me with composed patience. "Misunderstanding is perhaps the wrong term," she replied carefully, each word chosen to project reasonableness. "I've tried multiple times to address my concerns through appropriate channels. You've refused to respond or cooperate." "Karen," I countered, consciously softening my tone, "those channels never included moving into someone else's private property. Surely you understand this is illegal." She shrugged lightly, her composure unshaken. "Perhaps in a technical sense," she conceded. "But the intent is justified. This structure remains out of step with our community's aesthetics, and I feel compelled to demonstrate what improvement could look like." Frustration surged beneath my carefully maintained composure. The sheer audacity behind her words felt almost surreal. Sensing the conversation was going nowhere, I appealed to her sense of neighborly goodwill, mentioning our shared history in Willow Cove and emphasizing the importance of mutual respect. For a brief moment, her expression softened slightly, perhaps recalling moments of civility we'd shared in the past. But just as quickly, her features hardened again, her eyes regaining their familiar, authoritative glint. "Mutual respect also involves adhering to community expectations," she countered firmly. "Ignoring them weakens the entire neighborhood." Our exchange attracted attention once more from neighbors passing by. A few paused, watching curiously but unwilling to involve themselves directly. My plea for community support remained unanswered, leaving me isolated in this peculiar standoff. Karen had effectively positioned herself as the reasonable party, calmly articulating her case while I appeared increasingly flustered. Finally, recognizing my diplomacy was futile, I stood, signaling the end of our fruitless discussion. Karen watched me with detached satisfaction, her point seemingly proven by my retreat. Walking away, I felt the weight of her victory pressing down upon me, yet simultaneously, the seed of a more decisive plan began quietly forming in my mind. The night following my failed negotiation brought little rest, my mind endlessly turning over Karen's calculated defiance. Her quiet confidence and the boldness of her trespass had effectively neutralized diplomatic resolution. Conventional routes, HOA mediation, legal action, or neighborly intervention, would either move too slowly or, worse, legitimize her actions in the eyes of the community. I needed something more immediate, more direct, yet undeniably elegant in its simplicity. As moonlight filtered softly through my bedroom curtains, I considered the boathouse itself. Its wooden structure rested lightly upon sturdy floats and a foundation of buoyant pontoons. I recalled how easily it swayed when strong winds stirred the lake, gently pulling at its anchor ropes. A thought took shape, quietly at first but quickly gaining clarity and momentum. I realized with mounting certainty that Karen's audacious takeover relied entirely on the stationary comfort of the boathouse's anchor. Rising quietly from my bed, I padded barefoot to the window, looking out at the lake gleaming quietly under the stars. The boathouse, faintly visible at the shoreline, had always symbolized tranquility and refuge. Now, ironically, it provided Karen with a platform for dominance. I smiled, sensing that her perceived strength anchored firmly in place might easily become her weakness. If the boathouse were adrift, Karen would find herself isolated, forced by circumstance into a public position of vulnerability. Early the following morning, I shared my tentative plan with Mark, my closest neighbor, and a known skeptic of HOA overreach. Mark listened intently, his eyebrows raising first in surprise, then amusement. He leaned forward conspiratorially, grinning at the audacity and creativity of the scheme. "You're really planning to float her out onto the lake?" he asked, stifling a laugh. "Exactly," I responded, my voice steady and confident. "If Karen wants to occupy my boathouse, she can occupy it fully, even if it means drifting on open water." Mark laughed, clearly delighted. "Well, it's poetic justice at its finest, and it's hard to argue with your reasoning," he admitted. "But you're sure it can float safely out there?" I nodded decisively. I had studied the boathouse's structure carefully in the past, always mindful of storms or structural maintenance. The pontoons were sound, their construction designed precisely for stability and buoyancy. The ropes anchoring the boathouse were easily removable, secured only by simple knots I had tied myself. Satisfied by my assurance, Mark agreed to help discreetly, promising to spread casual diversions should Karen or other neighbors become suspicious. With his cooperation secured, I spent the remainder of the day subtly preparing. I inspected the ropes, greased a few stubborn bolts, and quietly positioned a small rowboat nearby to follow behind, ensuring Karen's safety despite her trespass. The plan was ambitious yet elegantly simple. Karen's carefully maintained facade of composure and control would crumble in plain view of everyone who had silently endured her rule. As dusk approached, my preparations complete, I stood once more at the shoreline, anticipation settling calmly within me. Tomorrow, I would restore balance, turning Karen's act of entitlement into a spectacle of her own making. At dawn the next morning, the sky painted itself in soft pastels, pale pinks and delicate oranges blending above the tranquil lake surface. It felt almost surreal, a moment of quiet beauty poised against the carefully planned upheaval that was about to unfold. Moving swiftly but silently, I approached the boathouse, my footsteps muffled by the damp grass and soft earth. Karen, typically an early riser, seemed still asleep, the curtains she'd hung drawn shut, obscuring any movement within. Mark stood at a discreet distance near the tree line, watching quietly with barely concealed amusement. I signaled him briefly, feeling a strange sense of calm as I gently loosened the knots securing the boathouse to its moorings. The ropes, long weathered by sun and water, slid easily through my hands. With a faint creak, the boathouse shifted almost imperceptibly at first, hesitantly finding its freedom. Encouraged, I carefully nudged it further away from the shore. Gradually, it began to glide smoothly onto the lake, drifting silently away from its former anchor point, gently propelled by a faint morning breeze. I stepped back onto solid ground, watching the boathouse slowly float further outward. At first, nothing stirred within. Then suddenly, the front door swung open, revealing Karen framed dramatically in the doorway. Her carefully maintained composure dissolved in an instant, replaced by stark panic as she took in her unexpected surroundings. She gasped audibly, gripping the doorframe in disbelief. "Stop!" she shouted urgently, her voice echoing across the water with surprising clarity. "What do you think you're doing? Bring this back immediately." I stood quietly on the shore, arms folded patiently. Mark chuckled softly from his position nearby, clearly entertained by the unfolding scene. Karen continued to shout demands, each command sounding more desperate and futile than the last as the boathouse drifted further from the shore. Finally, realizing her orders had no effect, she withdrew hastily into the boathouse. Moments later, her voice rose again, audible as she frantically dialed her phone. The call Karen made was unsurprising. Her voice, still carrying clearly across the water, pleaded urgently with the 911 dispatcher, describing her predicament in detail. Mark laughed quietly, shaking his head at the absurdity of Karen's self-created crisis. Soon after, the distant wail of emergency sirens approached, signaling the rapid arrival of local responders. Within minutes, police and fire department vehicles pulled into view, their lights casting bright flashes against the still morning landscape. First responders emerged onto the shoreline, visibly confused by the unusual scene they found. Karen, standing now on the boathouse deck, waved her arms urgently, shouting instructions that were swallowed partly by distance. On shore, an officer approached cautiously, struggling to suppress a smile as he took in the drifting boathouse and its frazzled occupant. The officer turned to me, curiosity evident. "Care to explain what happened here?" Calmly, I recounted the situation, carefully detailing Karen's unauthorized occupancy and her repeated refusal to vacate. The officer nodded slowly, glancing occasionally toward the drifting boathouse, clearly amused yet professionally composed. "I see," he responded thoughtfully, jotting notes in his notebook. "Certainly a unique approach. We'll handle it from here." Out on the lake, Karen's shouts diminished into defeated silence, replaced by frustrated pacing along the boathouse deck. Neighbors, drawn by the sirens, began congregating along the shore, murmuring with restrained delight at seeing Karen's control publicly dismantled. The boathouse, now stopped by a gentle current near the lake's center, bobbed gently in place, a quiet monument to Karen's arrogance and the unexpected outcome of her overreach. The arrival of emergency services transformed the previously serene lakeside into a lively scene of curious confusion. Officers stood at the shoreline, radios buzzing as they assessed the unusual situation. Firefighters quickly prepared a rescue raft, their movements methodical and precise despite occasional smirks exchanged discreetly among themselves. A few officers struggled visibly to maintain their professional demeanor, clearly amused by the absurdity of Karen's predicament. Karen, stranded in the drifting boathouse, paced nervously along the deck, occasionally pausing to wave her arms and shout directives toward the shore. Her instructions, however, were lost to distance, drifting faintly across the lake with no effect. Finally recognizing her lack of control, she folded her arms tightly, glaring impatiently as the rescue raft, manned by two bemused firefighters, made its way slowly across the lake toward her floating refuge. On shore, the community quickly gathered in a loose semicircle, whispering quietly among themselves. Neighbors who had initially hesitated to speak up against Karen now openly shared amused observations, their voices tinged with a combination of relief and delight. Many laughed openly, finding humor and satisfaction in the spectacle unfolding before them. Even those sympathetic to Karen's predicament admitted privately that her brazen takeover had finally received a fitting consequence. The firefighters soon reached the drifting boathouse, maneuvering alongside gently before securing it temporarily with rope. Karen eagerly stepped onto their raft, her relief clear but mixed with evident embarrassment. As she neared the shore, whispers rose briefly into excited chatter, before subsiding again into a tense silence. Upon reaching land, Karen stepped carefully onto solid ground, her expression a studied mixture of defiance and wounded dignity. An officer politely approached her, quietly confirming details of the incident while maintaining a neutral, professional tone. Karen initially tried framing the event dramatically, describing herself as an innocent victim of reckless endangerment. Yet, as neighbors and witnesses began to share their own recollections, the true context emerged clearly and calmly. Karen's attempt to portray herself as a victim rapidly unraveled, leaving her quietly seething but ultimately subdued. Throughout the morning, various community members approached me privately, offering their congratulations or simply expressing gratitude for standing firm. Even neighbors previously silent in Karen's presence found newfound confidence, openly criticizing the authoritarian tactics that had long characterized the HOA under her influence. Mark, ever supportive, stood nearby, his presence reassuring as he quietly enjoyed the communal shift. Eventually, Karen retreated to her home, accompanied by a few sympathetic friends who maintained their distance from the now openly critical majority. The officers concluded their reports, speaking briefly with me before departing with clear amusement and reassurance that no serious charges would emerge from the harmless act of retaliation. The fire crew lingered briefly, smiling broadly as they packed their gear, shaking their heads at the memorable morning. As the excitement gradually subsided, neighbors dispersed back toward their homes, voices still humming with amusement and satisfaction. The incident, already becoming a community legend, promised to serve as a lasting reminder of the limits of control and the power of creative resistance. In the days following Karen's floating debacle, a subtle yet undeniable shift transformed the neighborhood atmosphere. Karen initially retreated from public view, her usually prominent presence reduced to curt glimpses behind closed curtains. Her reputation, carefully constructed around authority and order, had suffered considerably, reshaping the delicate power dynamics of Willow Cove. The HOA scheduled an emergency meeting to address the incident, attracting record attendance. Inside the clubhouse, neighbors eagerly exchanged smiles and whispered commentary, awaiting official discussion. Karen attended reluctantly, arriving quietly, her usual confidence muted beneath cautious humility. When she finally spoke, her tone carried unusual restraint, emphasizing only her intention to uphold neighborhood standards. Despite her attempts at explanation, the community remained unimpressed, openly challenging her tactics and attitude for the first time. As neighbors took turns voicing their opinions, consensus formed swiftly. Karen's unilateral approach was no longer acceptable. The board resolved to reassess the overly stringent rules that had emboldened her actions, pledging a more balanced approach in the future. Karen, silent and visibly frustrated, watched as her carefully cultivated authority dissolved under communal scrutiny. Though no formal sanctions were imposed, the message was clear: her dominance had ended. Following the meeting, community life gradually returned to a relaxed normality. Neighbors, once fearful of Karen's watchful criticism, now reclaimed their lawns and porches with renewed confidence. Conversations grew warmer and less guarded, infused with newfound camaraderie born from a shared moment of triumph and laughter. Karen herself adapted slowly, choosing quieter paths and noticeably softer interactions. Her strict enforcement faded into hesitant suggestions, offered politely and without expectation of immediate compliance. Though traces of her previous authority occasionally resurfaced, they no longer held the power they once commanded. Willow Cove found its equilibrium, guided by mutual respect rather than fear of retribution. For my part, the boathouse returned to its rightful place along the shoreline, restored and quietly respected. Its brief journey, forever woven into neighborhood lore, reminded everyone that balance lay not in rigid conformity, but in appreciating the gentle chaos of authentic community. Weeks later, Karen and I exchanged polite nods across the street, neither mentioning the infamous drifting boathouse. Occasionally, neighbors playfully teased about floating new ideas, causing Karen to blush faintly but smile despite herself. The boathouse resumed its peaceful routine, anchored firmly, serving as both sanctuary and symbol. Willow Cove settled back into pleasant tranquility, now tempered by gentle laughter. Everyone understood that sometimes the best way to address stubbornness was simply to let it drift a while. Life along the lake remained idyllic, punctuated occasionally by reminders that a little humor could keep even the strongest personalities anchored.